Hey guys, and welcome back, or if you're new here, hi, my name's Georgia, and on my platforms here on the internet, I mostly talk about unsolved true crime. However, I did used to cover a lot of serial killers on this platform, but as time went on, I learned more about the community around true crime. As I grew up and became more acquainted with the morals and ethics of the genre, it kind of became something I was less comfortable platforming. I decided instead to just cover the cases as and when they piqued my interest, when they were relevant, focusing more on the victims instead of a deep dive on the killer themselves. And that's exactly what I'm going to do today. Today's story is about the victims, about how to know the warning signs of something like this, because this was missed for so long and it could have been stopped. Today I'm going to be talking about the crimes of Bruce McArthur, the most prolific serial killer to ever have been active in Toronto, Canada. You may have also heard this case in the media as the Toronto Murders or the Santa Claus Killer, simply because he played Santa during the Christmas season at the local mall. I hate that moniker, it makes him sound all jolly and fluffy, a misunderstood old man. It softens his crimes. Bruce McArthur is a killer. Just overall, there were so many issues with how this case played out, but the media coverage of this case would prove to be unfairly biased in mine and many others' personal opinions. The media showcased him as this jolly Santa, Bruce McArthur's story taking precedence over the actual victims. Some newspapers would even include happy smiley pictures of MacArthur from his Facebook page while showing the past mugshots of his victims. The impact of coverage like that isn't to be underestimated. It puts forward a certain idea of the case, of the victims, of the murderer, and hopefully I can help correct that with this episode. I've been getting requests to cover MacArthur for a really long time, and because I don't really cover serial killer cases anymore, I was kind of hesitant to do so. But the more I looked into this case, the more I realised that the true story actually needs to be put out there. MacArthur is responsible for the deaths of at least 8 men who went missing from Church and Wellesley, which is Toronto's gay village, between the years of 2010 and 2017. This is a case in which the deaths, the disappearances, weren't taken seriously by the authorities, either because they were gay or bisexual men, or because they were mostly immigrants from South Asia or the Middle East, or maybe it was a mixture of those two things. For various reasons, these were men who left their home countries, most of which didn't think kindly of homosexuality, for Canada, a place where for the most part they thought they would be safe to express themselves and their homosexuality. They put their trust in people who they thought would protect them, and both Bruce McArthur and the authorities failed. It has been speculated that MacArthur purposely targeted vulnerable communities, knowing that his crimes would go undetected for longer. From 2010, people in Toronto's gay village were talking of a possible serial killer in the area. People were whispering to be careful, to keep an eye out, noticing their friends go missing one by one. And still, the authorities didn't do anything. It took way too long for them to actually take action. This is very much a case study in what not to do for investigators, because whilst all of this did eventually become the largest investigation conducted by the Toronto Police Service, or the TPS, at first they were very hesitant to accept that there was any problem at all. All these men going missing were just individual cases apparently, men who made questionable lifestyle choices and went off the grid. This case is infamous for the many criticisms of the TPS's handling of the missing persons investigations, and in the years that have followed there have been numerous internal and external reviews to ensure that nothing like this ever happens again. In writing the script, I actually can't help but think back to the Stephen Port case from here in the UK, who was another serial killer who targeted gay men mostly on the app Grindr, another case in which the authorities refused to take the murder seriously, instead putting each death down to a self-administered drug overdose of GHB. That was just what gay men did, they said. They lived a risky lifestyle, they took drugs. But no, Stephen Port was spiking and murdering them. There are a lot of parallels between these two stories, the crimes even taking place over a very similar time frame. So if you're interested in hearing about Stephen Port, I'll link that video down below. I'm going to give a very sort of need to know insight into Bruce McArthur here, because whilst I don't want to focus too much on him as a person, his background and the years leading up to his crimes are incredibly relevant to what he would later do. So he was born on October 8th, 1951 in Lindsay, Ontario, Canada, to devout religious parents. His mother was Irish Catholic and his father was Scottish Presbyterian, and Bruce would often find himself in the centre of arguments between his two parents. It's said that he would often end up siding with his Catholic mother, which earned derision from his father. There was always this sort of very clear upset between the two. I can imagine being stuck between two very religious parents was very difficult when MacArthur eventually realised that he was gay, never feeling safe enough to come out. Alongside the religious parents, he also lived in rural Ontario, growing up throughout the 50s and the 60s. There would have been little to zero queer representation. Homosexuality would have been very, very frowned upon. It would not exactly have been an environment conducive to coming out. MacArthur would later say that he always sensed that his father knew he was gay, but it was just kind of this big unspoken thing. It drove even more of a wedge between them. In 1973, so now in his early 20s, MacArthur begins to work in a department store in Toronto, just a few blocks south from the gay village that was currently forming on Yonge Street. Somebody in Toronto, let me know how that's pronounced. This was a few years after the decriminalisation of homosexuality in Canada, so same-sex sexual activity between consenting adults over the age of 21 was made lawful on the 27th of June 1969. And coincidentally, this was just the day before the Stonewall riots in New York, which was considered to be the hairpin drop heard around the world, the beginning of the Pride movement as we know it today. But importantly, decriminalisation in Canada didn't mean just a sudden change of everyone's opinions of homosexuality. It's not like all of society overnight was just oh okay, yeah, we're totally fine with gays now. It would still be a very slow process. Although today, in 2023, Canada is considered one of, if not the most LGBTQ+ friendly country in the world. But as this case today clearly shows, old stigmas remain, with the authorities refusing to take the disappearances in the gay village seriously. It was found after reviews that there was a stigma there, they were treated differently. The Church and Wellesley Gay Village in Toronto is the area of the city in which you'll mostly come across LGBT establishments catering directly to the community. Gay villages are so important. They're oases in cities which might otherwise be hostile, or maybe you just want to find your people. The spaces are utilised to become safe spaces, a place where queer people can go and know they'll be relatively safe. I know that myself as a queer woman, whenever I go to a new city, I will search out the gay village, or the gayborhood as it's sometimes called, and I'll attempt to stay and socialise as close by as possible, especially if I'm with my fiancé. These spaces are so important in cities. Now, working so close to the gay village definitely would have come with some temptations for MacArthur, who in the mid-1980s becomes very active within his church just to keep himself busy, to lose himself in religion and avoid his homosexual feelings. His parents both died in 1978 and 1981, and at this time he was already married to Janice Campbell, and they would go on to be together for more than a decade. They'd have 2 children together, and they lived in Oshawa, which is a city just east of Toronto. Through the church and his straight-appearing marriage, MacArthur tried to stay away from his homosexuality, but in the early 90s he finally begins acting on his feelings. I kind of wonder if the death of both his parents had anything to do with this, his willingness to now act, or maybe it was just a case of not being able to live a lie any longer. He actually ended up coming out to Janice and they remained together for a few more years, but in 1997 they would separate and MacArthur moved to Toronto, apparently because Oshawa didn't have a gay community. He moved into an apartment on Don Mills Road, which is about 14 kilometres from Church and Wellesley, and he started up what would become a 4-year-long relationship with another man. Finally, he seemed to be in a situation where he was accepting himself and his sexuality, and I would usually be all for that, but we know where this story is headed. Eventually, him and his partner broke up just as his divorce to Janice was being finalised, and so he fell into a period of depression, actually having to go and see a psychiatrist. He'd lost his job in the department store many years earlier and actually started working as a self-employed landscaper, but he struggled to find jobs. At this time, he was not in a good place, and it was around this point that his proclivity towards violence would really begin to show, because before the murder started, he was involved in a number of assaults, with the first that we know of taking place on Halloween 2003. It was just after noon on the 31st of October when MacArthur was invited back to the apartment of Toronto actor and model Mark Henderson, just to see his Halloween costume. The pair kind of knew each other in passing, like they'd say hello on the streets, and they were close enough that Henderson invited MacArthur into his home. There was no sexual encounter between the two, and in a seemingly unprovoked attack, when Henderson had his back turned, MacArthur struck him several times from behind with an iron pipe that he'd been carrying. Now, Mark fought back but ended up losing consciousness, eventually calling 911 when he woke up. Thankfully, he'd been left alive. He was rushed to St Michael's Hospital where he had multiple injuries to his head and his body, which required several stitches and 6 weeks of physiotherapy. In a later interview, Mark said, "Every muscle in MacArthur's face was clenched and he had a look like a Komodo dragon. He was just a reptile. He was full of rage. I remember feeling the indentation in my skull. He had literally popped my skull in. I have a nursing background and I see cerebral spinal fluid and blood coming down, and I think I'm going to lose consciousness in a matter of seconds," and he was not going to stop. Now, MacArthur did turn himself in almost immediately after the attack, but he said that he didn't really remember it or why he might have committed it. He apologised for the pain and suffering that he'd caused and pled guilty to charges of assault with a weapon and assault causing bodily harm. However, thanks to the fact that he turned himself in, he was able to avoid jail time, instead receiving a conditional sentence of 729 days when psychiatric and pre-sentencing reports showed that he was at low risk to re-offend. He apparently seemed genuinely ashamed of his actions. He turned himself in. He apologised to the victim, saying, "I'd like to apologise. I wouldn't know what to say, other than I'm sorry for all the pain and anger that I've caused him." Instead of a prison sentence, he spent a year under house arrest, 6 months on curfew, and 3 months on probation. He was also banned from spending any time in church in Wellesley, except for work and medical appointments. Crown attorney Michael Leshner said how in the sentencing their main concern was keeping MacArthur away from male sex workers, saying, "We believe that until he has a much better psychiatric handle on himself, and given the background of this case, that's part of the subculture he's best kept away from. From my perspective, it's in the best interest to keep him out of the area where he's more than likely to come into, to likely be enticed by male prostitutes." I really don't know why they focus so much on male sex workers here. I don't know if Henderson himself was a sex worker. Nothing I said explicitly said that, but otherwise, why did they focus on sex workers in the sentencing? Maybe MacArthur made some comment in his psychiatric report. I really don't know, but he was told to stay away from any sort of male sex worker. Other conditions of his sentencing included a prohibition on taking illegal drugs and poppers, as it was suggested that he may have taken poppers on the day of the assault and he usually took them prior to sex. He'd also been on the anti-seizure medication Dilantin, and as they had no idea how these two drugs interacted with each other, and apparently MacArthur had no idea what caused the incident, he needed to stay away from poppers. He was also ordered to seek counselling for mental health issues, particularly for anger management, and he was forbidden to possess firearms for 10 years. From the outside, it seemed like he did abide by all these rules. He went on to become a law-abiding citizen, and in 2014, MacArthur was actually granted a record suspension, and this conviction was wiped from his records. So from this point onwards, it would not have appeared in any criminal background checks. But a law-abiding citizen, he was not. Whilst the assault case was still ongoing, he actually registered with a gay fetish dating website called Recon for men into BDSM, and he noted his interest in submissive men. Now, of course, this alone is not an indicator of anything. We do not kink shame here, but it is telling he specifies that he's looking for submissives, considering what he would go on to do. Around this time, he also attends a number of parties with younger men of South Asian or Middle Eastern descent, with a friend of his son's later saying that the walls of MacArthur's bathroom was just covered with pictures of naked men with erections, most appearing to be of East Indian descent, and apparently he would just laugh over this at breakfast. In the following years, despite him not being allowed to spend any time in the gay village, he becomes a staple in the gay community and a regular at its bars. He became known for his enjoyment of BDSM and rough sex. By 2007, he was living in an apartment just 3 miles northeast of Church in Wellesley. In 2011, he allegedly tells an acquaintance, Robert James, about an incident where he's asked to leave a coffee shop after he knocked all the glasses off the counter in a rage. His anger issues haven't subsided in the years since the assault, it seems, and when James shares some other stories that he'd heard about MacArthur, MacArthur reportedly turns red and starts screaming, using anti-gay slurs. The warning signs were always there with Bruce McArthur, it just took a very long time for anyone to really see them. And here I suppose is where we move into the timeline of the murders and focus more on the victims instead, beginning in September 2010 when on the 16th, 40-year-old Skandaraj Navaratnam, known as Skandar to his friends, is reported as missing. Skandar was last seen 10 days beforehand, leaving a gay bar in the village called Zippers in the early hour of the 6th September with an unknown man. In the words of Kevin Nash, who was a friend of Skandar's, if you knew Skandar, you would love him. He was a very attractive, handsome young man with a charismatic attitude. He loved to laugh. Skandar would do anything for anybody if they ever needed his help, and he just wanted to fit into Canada. He was a very humble, sincere person. Apparently, when Nash's son went missing briefly one summer, Skandar didn't hesitate to hop on his bike and scour Toronto's parks looking for him. His brother described him as the live wire in our family who just wanted to give his family a better life. He was said to be unbeatable at Scrabble, a massive animal lover and an environmentalist who sought to protect Sri Lankan forests. His best friend Jean-Guy Cloutier used to text him every morning and described him as a very proud man who took care of his appearance. Skandar was always making sure that he was seen in a positive light. Again, he said that Skandar was always there to help out a friend in need. Skandar was a Tamil refugee from Sri Lanka who headed to Canada on his own to escape the civil war in his home country. Once in Canada, he found his chosen family while staying close with his family back home as well, doing everything he could to help them. Now, when he disappeared, Skandar had recently got a new dog, a puppy, who he'd completely fallen in love with, and uncharacteristically, he left the dog alone at home. It just wasn't like him. It was his best friend Jean-Guy who reported Skandar as missing when he didn't receive any morning texts for several days in a row, and then they found the dog alone. But nothing much was really done by the authorities immediately after this report came in. My research actually tells me that at this time, Toronto police didn't even have a specialised missing persons unit, so the investigation was just a bit bitty. Documents that were later released revealed that in early October 2010, a detective looking into his disappearance wrote an application for Skandar's mobile phone records, saying that an unknown person or persons without lawful authorities seized Skandar Navaratnam, which is proof that early on there was speculation that he was met with foul play. So why wasn't it followed through on properly? A week after his disappearance, police and a dozen or so friends did search paths and wooded areas, particularly around Riverdale Park north of Bloor Street, which is where it's known that gay men would often meet up. Cadaver dogs and members of the mounted unit were eventually brought in to assist as well, but that was then kind of it for 2 whole years, just radio silence. And then later that same year, on December 30th, 2010, 42-year-old Abdul Bazir or Bazir Faizi was also reported as missing by his wife. He was last seen leaving his workplace, although later records suggest that he may have last been seen in the gay village, with his last night out including a trip to the Black Eagle Bar, which MacArthur was known to frequent, and the Steamworks bathhouse. Bazir's car, a 2002 Nissan Sentra, would later be found abandoned on Moore Avenue, which just so happened to be a very short distance from Mallory Crescent and a home that MacArthur was found to work at a lot with his landscaping business. He was a very well-known landscaper in this area. He was highly trusted by a lot of people. And I think it's important context to know that he was just a really well-liked person, MacArthur. His company was reputable. A lot of people just trusted him with the keys for their homes, so he could come and go and work as he pleased. And the residents on Mallory Crescent were one of these clients. MacArthur had constant access to this house with a deal that he'd tend to the owner's garden or yard in exchange for storage space in their garage for his landscaping equipment, so this was essentially a kind of second base for MacArthur. Bazir Faizi was an immigrant from Afghanistan, and whilst it's known that he did frequent the gay village, he was not out to his family. Again, a lot of these men came from home countries where homosexuality was punishable by death, Afghanistan being one of those. Moving to Canada, which is a much kinder country towards the LGBT community, isn't necessarily going to mean that closeted people immediately just shed all their fears. Bazir was actually married with a wife and 2 young daughters, and when he disappeared, his wife actually ended up filing for divorce, claiming that he had abandoned his family and his duties. This does kind of make me wonder if perhaps she knew that something was up with her husband, that he was sneaking around. The idea that he'd abandoned them for a different life seemed much more likely to her than foul play. But friends said that they didn't believe that he'd abandoned them, saying that the last time they spoke to Bazir, he was working overtime to make sure his kids got everything they wanted for Christmas. He was a family man. Seeing as Bazir wasn't out and he also lived in the suburbs of Toronto, his case wasn't connected to Skander's for a really long time. Like I said, even his wife believed that he'd just chosen to leave. However, in a later victim impact statement, when the reality of his disappearance came out, she said that she'd lost her ability emotionally and physically to do daily activities, and that their daughters suffered terribly with the knowledge of what happened to their father. She said that their daughters would carry around photos of their dad, and when they were alone, they'd talk about their memories with him. It was just a really difficult loss. So both of those disappearances happened in 2010, but no connections were made for a really long time, and then things seemed to just go silent for quite a while. That is until the 25th of October 2012, when 58-year-old Majid or Hamid Kayan is reported as missing by his adult son. He was last seen at church in Wellesley a week beforehand on October 18th, and once again, it seems like he wasn't out as gay or bisexual. Unfortunately, it was quite difficult to find information out about Hamid, but we know he had an ex-wife and children, having fled with them to Canada from Afghanistan in the late 1980s. In the words of Reverend Jeff Rock, who spoke at a later vigil for him, he was known for his love of Indian Bollywood movies and especially the songs. Sadly, Hamid struggled with PTSD in the aftermath of the Soviet-Afghan War, and he had an alcohol addiction. It was only after this point that Toronto police really started to take notice, and in November 2012, Project Houston was launched to investigate the disappearances of all three men. By this time, Skander, Bazir and Hamid had all been linked thanks to the fact they were all middle-aged immigrants of Asian origin who disappeared in Toronto. In December 2012, the investigators obtained the first judicial order of this project, which was a tracking warrant for a vehicle, but this was sealed from the public, claiming they needed to protect a confidential source and an underage victim. So we don't know loads about this, but this would be the first of many warrants to come. In March 2013, another granted allowance for more than a half dozen different undercover officers to record their electronic and in-person interactions with a person whose identity is redacted. So in the early days of Project Houston, they definitely had their suspects, leads they were following. One suspect whose name was made public was Alex Brunton, who lived in nearby Peterborough but was known to frequent Toronto's gay village, especially the nightclubs. He was brought to authorities' attention by a tip that came in, and so investigators dug into his life as part of Project Houston, seizing computers from his home on which they found a collection of child pornography alongside a much larger collection of adult pornography. Part of his collection consisted of videos that he'd secretly recorded in the showers and changing rooms of Peterborough Hockey Arena, with many of the men he recorded being 17-year-old boys. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. They also found pictures and a couple of short video clips of a teenager from Colorado who he met in 2009 when the boy was just 15, through what was described as a troubling cannibal fetish website. Over the span of 3 years, Brunton sent the boy more than $3,500 in exchange for naked photos. It was a grooming relationship based around the idea of cannibalism. Brunton was not a good man. He was arrested in May 2013, and they were never able to find anything linking him to the murders of the three men, obviously, but they certainly did find enough to put him behind bars. He was sentenced to 2 years in jail and 3 years probation, but thanks to the time he'd already spent, he was free by the end of that same year. It simply was not enough for such a deeply troubled man. The apprehension of Brunton ended up being literally the only thing to come out of Project Houston, which ended up closing in April 2014 after failing to return any criminal evidence. Now, MacArthur was actually spoken to as part of Houston, but never as a possible suspect, just as a witness, after investigation showed he had links to both Skander and Bazir, and it never went any further than this. In this time, it looked to investigators like the killer, if it was just one man, had seemed to stop his crimes. No one had disappeared since October 2012. Perhaps that could have been because he knew the extent of the investigation that was happening because he was questioned as part of it. MacArthur knew what was going on. But of course that wasn't to last, because in August 2015, 50-year-old Sarush Mahmoodi is reported as missing by his wife. He was last seen in South Cedarbrae on August 12th near his home, and in the words of friend Brett Morrison, "We went on camping trips together. I remember taking him to his first Blue Jays game. I worked with him for close to a decade. Up until 2008, we worked on the same line together." The pair worked together in a manufacturing plant after Sarush came to Canada from Iran as a refugee. He was said to be an easygoing jokester who liked to play soccer. He was liked by everyone who met him, and then he vanished. The same month, 37-year-old Krishna Kumar Kanagaratnam also disappeared. He was a Tamil refugee fleeing Sri Lanka, just like the first victim, Skanda. Krishna Kumar was said to be the responsible one. He was the fourth of 6 siblings, and he lost his younger brother in 2007 when he was killed during the conflict in Sri Lanka. He ended up moving to Canada, and up until August 2015, he called his mother every single day. But then one day, he just stopped calling. His family stopped hearing from him, and they didn't report him as missing because they were worried he was in hiding and the Canadian government would send him back if he was found. He was under a deportation order, so they had quite a good reason to be worried, and they were right. Now, Krishna Kumar definitely did go into hiding within the Tamil community in Toronto. He went into hiding around August 2015, and we found that he actually wasn't murdered until January 2016. His family described him as the kind of person who would give you the shirt off his back. When people back in Sri Lanka were desperate for water, everyone rationing what they could for themselves, he'd be the one to share his. On April 21st, 2016, Dean Lisselwick, in his early 40s, was also seen alive for the last time, checking into the Scott Mission on Spadina Avenue, which is a place he'd periodically stayed since 2003, and he was never reported as missing. Dean was said to have inherited his mother's artistic talent, and he loved to paint. He was always sending her his paintings. He kept in very close contact with his parents until he started to develop mental health problems, which ended up with him sleeping on the streets of Toronto. But still, he would occasionally send his mother cards for special occasions, and not just your bog standard cards, but instead ones that had to be carefully searched out for their expressions of love. His mother never gave up hope that one day she would see Dean alive again, but she died before they could get any answers in 2011. Apparently she was broken-hearted and constantly praying for his safety and well-being. They didn't know if he was dead or alive, or if his life on the streets had just taken him elsewhere. Acquaintances have said they were shocked that Dean ended up becoming a victim because he was incredibly street savvy and scrappy. He was always the person sort of protecting others on the street. He had a daughter who was still very young when he disappeared, but according to Dean's cousin, the last few times she saw him, Dean was kind of like actively making plans to make a better life for himself. He wanted to set goals, he loved his daughter and wanted to get his life together to buy her gifts and to love her. And then that was all ripped away. As I said, Dean wasn't reported as missing because he was on the streets, although people did notice he was gone. He was a big fixture in this area. It was kind of usual though for people to move on, get their lives together and disappear. So people on the streets saw that he'd gone, thought he just got his life together. His family saw he'd gone and thought he'd just moved on. Moving into 2017, the next victim to be reported as missing was 44-year-old Salim Essen on April 30th. He was last seen over a month beforehand on the 20th of March. According to his friends, Salim was in a very unhealthy relationship at the time of his disappearance, but they didn't really know any details of that. But he was making moves in his career. He'd recently completed a certificate course in peer counselling at St Stephen's Community House, and he was getting ready to offer his first sessions. Now, it would later turn out that Bruce McArthur was a regular and trusted client at St Stephen's, so that's probably where they met. In the words of friend Richard Kickott, Salim was a very sweet, soft person. Really, I want to say he was calm. At the time that I knew him, he was going through some challenges, so he wasn't completely relaxed, but he had a very calm nature about him. Very curious, very philosophical, a little intense even. Salim was an out gay man from Turkey who was very unhappy in his home country. It wasn't easy to be gay there, so he moved to Australia for a few years before moving to Canada to marry his boyfriends in 2013. Canada actually legalised same-sex marriage all the way back in 2005, so he could do that. Now, his marriage sadly wouldn't last, but he stuck around in Toronto. He liked it there. And despite being from Turkey, his family was super supportive of his sexuality and his choices. Their goal after everything happened being to fight for the LGBT community to live without fear. And they ask why that isn't happening in Canada. And fighting for people seems to be very much an Essen family trait, because that's what Salim was trying to do in life as well with his peer counselling programme. He was compassionate, caring, inquisitive. He felt strongly about equality and justice, and he cared deeply about the well-being of everyone around him. Salim very much sounds like somebody that I would have loved to have known. And then on June 29, 2017, 49-year-old Andrew Kinsman is also reported as missing, having last been seen in the Cabbagetown neighbourhood just 3 days earlier, according to a Toronto police report. He had attended the Toronto Pride March on June 26th and then just disappeared. A friend who saw him shortly before his disappearance said that he was very happy and upbeat, stable and responsible. Andrew's sister Shelley would later say in a victim impact statement that Andrew's intelligence shone very brightly from a very young age, and from the age of 4 he was a talented chess player. She claimed that he could skillfully defeat opponents who were 5 times his age. Shelley also said that Andrew was the kindest and most compassionate sibling, and despite his very gruff demeanour, he cared about everyone he met. In his spare time, he loved to bake, he loved to volunteer at the local food bank, and he loved to debate. Andrew spent decades involved with the Toronto HIV/AIDS network, and he had very deep roots within the queer community. Everyone in the village knew and loved him. Despite battles with cancer in the years before his death, he was committed to life, committed to living. He was determined to survive and live his life to the fullest, to help anyone in any way he could. He was also the superintendent of his building in the Cabbagetown neighbourhood, which is where he lived with his beloved 17-year-old cat, who was just the love of his life. Andrew just generally was a really busy man, because alongside all of that I just mentioned, he also worked as a bartender at the Black Eagle bar in the village for many years, which is a job through which he would have known MacArthur very well, who was a regular patron of the bar. When Andrew disappeared, this big stalwart of the Toronto queer community in Gay Village, people really noticed. When friends headed to his apartment and found his beloved cat left alone without any food and water, it was incredibly clear that something terrible had happened, because there is no universe in which Andrew would have willingly left his cat alone. He had also left his prescription medicine behind, and regardless, he just never would have gone off without letting his friends and family know where he was going. It just wasn't like him. For years at this point, the LGBT community in the village had been making noise about people going missing. If you asked people in the village, they would have told you there was a serial killer stalking this area. I mean, Canada had an incredibly low murder rate in this time, so many people going missing from this very tiny radius was very unlikely. People knew that something more sinister was going on, but the authorities didn't seem to be doing anything about it. And then when Andrew, this massive figure in the area, goes missing, they really kick up a stink. On July 28th that same year, another task force is set up in order to investigate the disappearances of Andrew and Salim, and this is called Project Prism. From very early on, they're working closely with the investigators from the old Project Houston, knowing there's a chance that these disappearances could be linked to the ones from 2010 and 2012. Days later, on August 1st, a community safety meeting takes place in the village, organised by a friend and colleague of Andrew's, Greg Downer. The police attend this, giving an overview of what the task force was aiming to do and thanking the community for the abundance of information that they had been able to provide. At the meeting, queer refugees, transgender and two-spirit people also speak of their experiences of disproportionate violence within the queer community. Now, Greg also had a group called the Missing Rainbow Community who offered strategies for staying safe when meeting people on dating apps. He's appealing for dating apps to have options for users to consent to have their data released to police if they go missing, which, to be honest, is a fantastic idea, although I'm sure it does have a few things to iron out before it's enacted. By mid-August, Project Prism was in full swing, with the first of 2 judicial orders being made, one being a production order for Google and the other for Rogers Communication. A production order gives police the power to compel a person or organisation to provide documents or records. So in this case, police were looking for IP address logs for Andrew's email account and cell phone records. Yeah, the murder of Andrew would turn out to be a huge mistake on MacArthur's account. After years of choosing marginalised victims who he knew wouldn't necessarily be noticed by the authorities, going for Andrew really was a choice. He was a huge face and name in the area. He was beloved by everyone who met him, a central figure in the village. Of course, people were going to notice when he just suddenly disappeared. And so, unlike many of the others, Andrew was reported as missing within 72 hours of his disappearance, which makes a huge difference to an investigation. Andrew was also white, and the fact that this investigation only really kicked into full gear with his disappearance has not been lost on me. It is very strange that Andrew was chosen as a victim. MacArthur had known Andrew for years, they had this very strong link, so it was much more likely that his disappearance would lead investigators to MacArthur's doorstep. I think at this point he was just getting cocky, maybe he needed more of a thrill. As part of their investigation, investigators obviously take a look at Andrew's home, in which they come across their first major break in this case. The word Bruce written on his calendar on the date he was last seen, the 26th of June. Could this Bruce be the last person to see Andrew alive, or was it more nefarious than that? Following this, investigators take a look at the surveillance footage from outside the apartment block, finding that Andrew had left that day in a large red vehicle driven by somebody else at 3 p.m, the same time noted in the calendar that he was meeting Bruce. The footage didn't show the driver nor the license plate, but investigation found that it was a 2004 Dodge Caravan. Now, there were more than 6,000 similar models in Toronto at this time, but only 5 of those were registered to somebody named Bruce, and the only 2004 model belonged to a Bruce McArthur, and this was the first time they came across his full name. Or at least I should say the first time that Project Prism came across his full name. So remember, he was interviewed as part of Houston. By September, investigators managed to match the van to surveillance footage of MacArthur's apartment, but by this point in time, there was no sign of the van itself. He'd got rid of it. So, on September 8th, they named MacArthur in a request to seal a production order. They were clearly looking at him very, very closely, and a couple of days later, they actually managed to get hold of a coffee cup that he discarded in order to generate a DNA profile. It's worth noting at this point that MacArthur was actually already the subject of a separate police investigation from the year beforehand, 2016, in which a man reported that MacArthur had pinned him down in his van and violently choked him. The pair had met on a dating app and were kissing when MacArthur grabbed him by the throat. Luckily, the victim managed to fight him off and escape the vehicle and did eventually go to the police, because this ended up leaving him unable to swallow for a whole week. But MacArthur got in ahead of him. He actually ended up going to the police of his own volition to share his own version of the incident. And he was arrested for the assault, but it was very short-lived. He basically said it was all this big misunderstanding. He thought that's what the victim wanted because he knew he liked it rough. He even claimed that the victim, who has always remained unnamed, even turned around and grabbed him by the throat, so it was just a mutual strangling. After the victim panicked and jumped out of the car, MacArthur decided to get a jump start on things and went to the police before the victim could. It was all very sort of like meditated. He knew exactly what he was doing. He just said it was all this big misunderstanding, and ultimately the authorities believed him. His story was deemed to be credible and he was just let go. There was never a proper investigation. If there was, might they have found something else? But then the officers involved in that case overheard his name mentioned in connection to Project Prism, and they connected the dots. Could it be that they'd got it all wrong, that MacArthur was actually a violent man and the strangulation hadn't been an accident at all? Well, yeah, that is exactly what happened. Remember by this point as well that the earlier assault from 2006 had been completely wiped from MacArthur's record, so no one had any idea of that this was a very clear pattern. But even without that, MacArthur being the last person to have seen Andrew Kinsman alive was enough alone to investigate him. On September 14th, police obtained a tracking warrant for 2 of MacArthur's vehicles in order to allow them the opportunity to monitor his movements. 2 days later, he sold an old, rusty, maroon-coloured Dodge Caravan to Dom's Auto Parts, an auto parts shop just outside of Toronto, and is captured on CCTV doing so. Now, knowing that this vehicle was going to be a very important piece of evidence, knowing that Andrew had been inside it before his disappearance, investigators spent a lot of time searching for it. They actually went to every auto store in the Toronto area before they got lucky and came across Dom's, which is miles outside the city, on October 3rd. Investigators turn up at the auto shop, they see the van, they go through the surveillance footage, and then they tow it away. Now, luckily for them, it was still pretty much in one piece, only the tyres had been removed. But other than that, it was still in pretty good condition for forensics. And they immediately, even before forensics, noticed something very suspicious: a dark, sticky substance covered in flies. Blood. Whilst all this is sent off for analysis, investigators are very closely tracking MacArthur, who has no idea that he is the subject of this massive investigation. They decide to bring in cadaver dogs to the Mallory Crescent house in Leaside, where it's known he worked and had free access to a storage space. The dogs at this time didn't indicate any human remains, but they did install a camera to monitor the garage, see if anything strange was going on. The owners of the Mallory Crescent house were said to be very cooperative with the police. They stated that MacArthur would frequent the house sometimes 2 to 3 times every day. He'd stored his equipment there for about a decade, and even when they went away, MacArthur would look after their home. He was this big trusted figure in their lives, and they often went away during the summer months. Importantly, they also said that they'd seen MacArthur working with younger males of Middle Eastern descent on multiple different occasions. Meanwhile, with a tracking warrant for his cell phone, investigators managed to build a timeline of the day that Andrew went missing, and with each new thing they find out, it's seeming more and more likely that Bruce McArthur is responsible. And then the forensics from the van comes back. They found DNA matching not only Andrew Kinsman but also Salim Essen on a metal bar wrapped in tape found inside. Later on, they also found Skandinav Ratham's DNA on some dark brown leather lacing, but not quite at this point in the investigation. All of this is enough for investigators to obtain a general warrant to search MacArthur's apartment at the beginning of December. And general warrants are not easy to obtain, so even the fact a judge was willing to grant one shows they had an abundance of evidence against him already. What they wanted most out of this warrant was to enter MacArthur's home and get the information off his computer, and for that they had to clone it. They wouldn't be able to see any sort of current time information by doing this, they wouldn't be able to access his social media like Facebook or anything behind a password, but they would be able to see the information and files saved to the computer itself. Now, you might wonder why they can't just use a search warrant and take the whole computer, but at this point in the investigation, they didn't want to alert MacArthur as to what was going on. As far as they were aware, he was completely oblivious. He might flee, he might make stupid decisions, he could start deleting things. They didn't want him to do any of that. So they had to clone it to keep him in the dark. But for that, they had to guarantee that he was out of his home for a significant period of time. Luckily for them though, at this point, they'd been tracking MacArthur for several weeks. They knew his movements like the back of their hand, and he had a pretty predictable routine. When they knew he was out one day, they gained entry to his home and started to clone his computer. Something they knew was going to take a while, but it's fine, they knew when he'd be back. Only on this day, his routine inexplicably changed, and police following him called the investigators in the apartment to warn them that he was on his way home. In the end, they had to finish the cloning early and just analyse what they could, leaving the home untouched just as MacArthur walked in back through the door. They were this close. And whilst all of this is happening, more people are disappearing from the village. On November 29th, the body of a young woman called Tess Ritchie is found by her own mother in an alleyway in the village, just 4 days after she was reported missing. The following day, the body of Laura Wells, a transgender woman, was identified after she'd been found in a ravine. With more people going missing and ending up dead in this very small area, the fears of a serial killer stalking Church Wellesley were just growing with every passing day. However, Toronto Police Service Chief Mark Saunders held a news conference on December 8th, stating that the police categorically did not believe a serial killer was responsible due to a lack of evidence. At the very same time, they're actively investigating Bruce McArthur. Now, I suppose they didn't want to out their investigation, they didn't want to incite unnecessary fear in the village, but I would perhaps argue that the fear was very much necessary. People needed to know to keep themselves safe. Bruce McArthur was still out there. In the very same news conference, it's announced that Project Prism has completed 62 witness interviews, 28 judicial authorizations, and assigned 308 actions, of which 225 had already been completed. They say that searches have been conducted by the mounted and canine units and a drone, and still at this point there is no evidence to link the disappearances, or so they're saying. It's incredibly frustrating. But they're still looking very closely at Bruce McArthur. Throughout January, they analysed the information they got of his computer, and they find numerous files titled with different names with photos of men in. But photos aren't illegal. And then on January 17th, they found 2 pieces of evidence directly connecting MacArthur to both Salim Essen and Andrew Kinsman. According to official documents, they found photos of the deceased victims on the computer files. MacArthur had attempted to delete the photos, hence why it had taken a while to find them, but they were able to through forensic analysis. There were said to be 18 photos of Andrew Kinsman taken after his death, in which he was posed on top of a fur coat. I don't really think it's necessary to share other details of the photos, you don't really need to know, but it does seem his cause of death was strangulation from marks they were seen on his body. They did also find photographs of multiple more of the victims, again not going to share details, however most of them also included the fur coat, all the bodies posed on top of this coat. The coat in question was found in a hidden compartment in the van. Now this is all pretty airtight evidence, but still they don't go in for the arrest just yet. When they found the post-mortem photos, they placed MacArthur on round-the-clock surveillance with instructions that he was to be immediately arrested if he was seen alone with anyone. So this was the 17th of January, and only a day later, officers witness a young man entering MacArthur's apartment, and they believe immediately that this man's life is at risk. 2 officers make their way up to the apartment and just knock on the door. I don't know if they were expecting him to, but MacArthur just immediately answers, and he is arrested on the spot, as the other officer goes in to make sure the young man was okay. Upon entering the bedroom, he found a naked male handcuffed to the bed. The man was said to be incredibly shaken, but overall uninjured, and the victim said that the pair had met on a gay dating app called Growler in the summer. Now this man, who has chosen to remain anonymous and is therefore just referred to as John, was again a Middle Eastern immigrant who was married and not out to friends and family. The 2 had been intimate on several occasions before this date, and on the 18th of January, MacArthur picked John up in a new van and asked him if anyone knew where he was going. He said no, it was entirely secret. When they got to the apartment, MacArthur told John to go straight to the bedroom, where he then said they should try something different, but they needed to be quick because his son or his roommate was coming home soon. John undressed and MacArthur returned with handcuffs and without consent used them to secure John to the bed. He then got a black leather bag from another room and placed it over John's head. There were no holes in it was hard to breathe, and MacArthur refused to remove it when he was asked to. So John struggled to remove it himself, and when he did so, MacArthur tried to tape his mouth shut. There is no denying what the motivation was here. John is really lucky that MacArthur was under surveillance at this point, and so his life was saved. With MacArthur now finally under arrest, they could properly access his computer, and forensic analysis revealed that MacArthur had access to a USB drive that contained, among many other things, a directory with 9 subfolders, the titles of which corresponded to the 8 victims he had murdered, titled Skander, Basir, Hamid, 4 and 5, because he wouldn't have known Sarush's and Krishna Kumar's names, Slider, which corresponded with a photo of Dean Lisselwick, also found with the file name Slidder, Turkish guy, meaning Salim, Andy, and chillingly there was even a folder pre-titled John, ready for the contents. This showed premeditation. What MacArthur did to his victims wasn't on a whim, he was ready to kill John. In each of the folders were photos of his victims before and after death, and in many of the photos you could clearly see parts of MacArthur's bedroom, his bed and his drawers. Following his arrest, Bruce McArthur is charged with 2 counts of first-degree murders in the deaths of Salim and Andrew, with police saying publicly that they hadn't found the bodies yet, but they had a pretty good idea of how they died, referencing the computer photos. Detective Sergeant Hank Singer, who'd been overseeing Project Prism, said that he was very satisfied that even without the bodies, there was enough evidence for murder convictions here. However, it wouldn't come to that because the very next day, on January 19th, the police executed a search warrant on the Mallory Crescent address where MacArthur stored his tools, and they turned up with cadaver dogs. The dogs this time quickly alerted to 5 large planters in the backyard, all of which were seized and brought in for testing. Inside, they found portions of 7 dismembered bodies. 4 of the 7 bodies had nearly complete remains found, being Andrew Kinsman, Salim Essen, Sarush Mahmoodi, and Karishna Kumar Kanagaratnam. Disturbingly, the men who were missing the longest seemed to have the most missing body parts. So Skandar Navaratnam and Basir Faizi had both been missing since 2010, and there were only a few of their parts remaining. They also found the remains of Dean Lissawick. The only victim whose body wouldn't be found immediately was Majid Hamid Kayand, but photos of him after death were found on the computer, hence the undeniable link that MacArthur was responsible for his death as well. His remains would later be found in an excavation of a ravine near the Mallory Crescent home. Over the coming weeks, as the bodies were slowly identified, MacArthur would be charged with 8 counts of first-degree murder in total. He was undeniably a serial killer. The cause of death for Andrew and Salim were confirmed as ligature strangulation, but for the rest it remained undetermined. Project Houston had determined links between MacArthur and Skandar and Hamid years earlier. He'd had an intimate relationship with Skandar, they were friends on Facebook. He admitted to knowing Hamid since 2003. He'd employed him with his landscaping business, and they also had a sexual relationship. And Basir's car was found abandoned just around the corner from Mallory Crescent, with investigation later finding that the homeowners of Mallory Crescent were actually away on the date of Basir's disappearance, and MacArthur was house-sitting. When they returned, they actually discovered a dark stain on the floor of their bedroom, which MacArthur told them was spilled Coca-Cola, but it was probably blood. The links between MacArthur, Skandar and Hamid should have been enough for Project Houston to look further all those years ago, but they didn't. All in all, with all this evidence, it became a pretty airtight case. By this point, it was undeniable what MacArthur had been up to, that a serial killer had been operating under the noses of the TPS for years. Skandar was the first victim. It's not entirely clear whether his murder was pre-planned or maybe it was an accident and unlocked something in MacArthur, but all the murders that followed were planned and deliberate. They were uniform. These murders had been going on since 2010. They'd been undetected for 8 years. And of course, the community had a lot of questions as to how on earth that had been allowed to happen, especially when it was clear years beforehand with Project Houston that something was going on. How had Houston been allowed to come to an end with no answers? On March 22nd, 2018, the Toronto Police Service Board announced an external review of how the police handled the missing persons cases. And in June 2018, the Ontario Court of Appeal Justice, Gloria Epstein, is named to lead an independent review, but this was going to be a very slow process. Meanwhile, the case against Arthur is just getting stronger and stronger by the day. There is literally no denying that he was the one responsible for these crimes. And he knows as much because on October 22nd, 2018, he waives his right to a preliminary hearing, sending the case straight to trial. On November 30th, the Superior Court judge sets January 2020 for the trial date. Moving into 2019, on January 29th, MacArthur pleads guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder. And his guilty plea means there's no need for the scheduled trial. He's now admitted to his crimes, nobody needs to prove anything, so instead he's going to go straight to sentencing. And with regards to sentencing, the prosecutor outlines all of the evidence they had. The staged photographs, the murder weapons, the premeditation. He says that each murder was either premeditated or involved other crimes which still qualified them as first degree. 6 of them were sexual in nature, whilst 5 included confinement. MacArthur also kept trophies from each victim, including jewellery and a notebook. He sought out vulnerabilities in his victims that he knew would make his crimes harder to detect. People he knew that people either wouldn't notice were missing or wouldn't make a fuss about, or simply the authorities wouldn't care. He used sex to lure them in and then would kill many of them in his bedroom via ligature strangulation. On the 4th of February, the hearing begins, where a statement of all these facts is read aloud, and friends and families of the victims read out victim impact statements in court. On the 8th of February, Judge John McMahon sentences Bruce McArthur to 8 life sentences to be served concurrently. He will be eligible for parole when he's 91 years old, but let's face it, he's very overweight and a type 2 diabetic. It's highly unlikely he will live to this age at all, and if he does, he's still not going to be paroled anyway. McMahon described the crimes as pure evil, saying MacArthur showed no remorse, and if he wasn't apprehended, he would have continued killing. MacArthur is now in prison, never to see the outside world again, never able to hurt anyone again. But that's not the end of this case, because there's also been a lot of controversy surrounding this case. Questions as to why law enforcement failed to see what was going on and put a stop to it. When they had people literally telling them what was going on, people in the village were telling them there was a serial killer on the loose, and they ignored them. Was this an institutional failure? Why did this happen? Well, there is a lot to unpack here. From the very beginning of this case, there was this general sense of reluctance from the authorities to use the word serial killer. TPS Chief Mark Saunders told the community at the time that all this was going on, the evidence today tells us there is not a serial killer. Why? Why was the evidence telling them that? It actually wasn't until January 29, 2018 that they finally confirmed they were dealing with an alleged serial killer, confirming what the community had known for years. The Church Wellesley Neighbourhood Association member Nikki Ward asked why weren't we listened to earlier? Perhaps some lives could have been saved if that was the case. Singer claimed that the police always had hunches that there was a serial killer involved here, but they couldn't say so without evidence. But in avoiding the word, more people were put in danger. Why couldn't they just warn people to be careful? Why are they going out there and saying, there's no serial killer? If they had hunches, why weren't they actively investigating them? Even the media was complicit in the shit show here. Longtime Toronto crime journalist James Dubrow wrote in July 2017 that a serial killer, though not ruled out, was highly unlikely. University of Toronto Associate Professor Ju-Young Lee, who teaches a course on serial homicides, said in November 2017 that the disappearances had the warning signs of a serial killer, but that remained unclear, and serial killers were very rare. People knew there was a serial killer here. Why was nobody doing anything? Meanwhile, University of Toronto PhD candidate Sasha Reid, who specialises in statistical analysis of missing persons and sexually motivated killers, was compiling a missing persons database when she came across Project Houston. She noticed a pattern and concluded that there was a serial killer operating in Toronto. She claimed to have informed police of her findings and provided a basic criminal profile in July 2017, the same month prison was created. But she wasn't contacted again by the police. Now, her profile did indicate a suspect of colour in his early 30s, which would have excluded MacArthur, but it was still something. It has been suggested that an arrest could have been made sooner if a serial killer was announced to the public. Criminologist and Western University professor Mike Arntfield compared it to the Seminole Heights serial killer in Tampa Bay in Florida. Here, police warned the public of a serial killer in November 2017, and this led to 5,000 tips coming in, one of which resulted in the arrest. The tips in Tampa Bay could also have been influenced by a $100,000 reward that was being offered at this time. Why was the same not replicated in Toronto? Money is a really powerful tool. People must have seen something. Who knows what tiny tip could have led the police to MacArthur sooner? Surely there were men out there who'd had questionable encounters with MacArthur because he was known to be on the dating apps constantly. He was known to be rough. Alongside all of this, we also have the allegations of racism within the Toronto Police Service. As I've already pointed out, the police only really looked into these disappearances when a white man, Andrew Kinsman, went missing. Singer has denied this vehemently. He said that Project Houston was a much bigger investigation than PRISM, and that was looking into the disappearance of men of colour, but you can't pin all of it on just this one thing. It's not just about the racism of the authorities that we need to look at here, because there's also suggested racism within the queer community itself, something which I'm sure a lot of the community would back up because it is a problem. There was a relatively weak response to the disappearance of the brown-skinned men when compared to the campaign to find white-skinned Andrew Kinsman. There have even been suggestions that MacArthur was initially overlooked as a suspect because he is white. In 2017, it was theorised by the aforementioned PhD candidate Sasha Reid that the killer was likely a person of colour like the victims, later saying this is because serial killers tend to target very familiar communities. which yes, does happen often. This is a genuine phenomenon, but equally we see serial killers targeting outside communities as well, so this shouldn't be taken as gospel. Of course, the authorities involved here have denied racism being a factor. TPS Chief Mark Saunders is a black man himself, but the fact is that this wasn't solved until a reputable white man went missing. Often racism runs so deep within these institutions that it wouldn't have been a conscious thing. It's likely no one thought, let's just ignore these people going missing because they have brown skin. But it's this undercurrent, it's ingrained so deeply that people don't even realise it. Even Saunders himself would later reference systemic biases in the force. And this is something that white people can get defensive about, and I understand why. It's never nice to think that you may have racist tendencies, but often when you're raised as a white person, it's easy to fall into certain traps. I'm white, I wouldn't consider myself to be actively racist. I actually actively spend time educating myself, learning about different people, different cultures. I would never in a million years treat somebody consciously different because of the colour of their skin. Does that mean I don't have unconscious biases? Of course not. We're products of the world we're raised in, and I'm sure I still have so much to learn. I will never experience the world as a person of colour. I say this to say that this is the vast majority of white people, and seeing as white people in Western countries are often the ones in power, the ones building these institutions from the ground up, it's very easy for this subtle racism to permeate things such as the police force or the government. Add the fact that this closely involved gay people as well, and it just keeps piling up. I'm sure I'll get comments calling me a snowflake, bleeding heart, liberal, leftist for that, but that's not an insult, so do your worst. But let's move on to the next criticism in this case, victim blaming. In the aftermath, Chief Mark Saunders expressed frustrations to Canadian newspaper The Globe and Mail that some sources which reported incidents after MacArthur's arrest could have changed the course of the investigation if they reported things at the time they happened. He said, "We knew that people were missing and we knew we didn't have the right answers, but nobody was coming to us with anything." This quote was run under the headline, "Toronto Police Chief says civilians failed to help investigation into alleged serial killer." And as you can imagine, this caused quite the backlash against Saunders, with the queer community of Toronto taking it as quite victim-blamey. After all, they had been noticing things for years, but they felt ignored by the police. Why is the police chief coming forward saying oh well, we could have solved it because we are the police, but you guys didn't help us enough? In a later interview, Saunders apologised if his comments were misconstrued or taken in the wrong context, and he said he hadn't intended to single out the LGBTQ community in doing so. He then expressed his gratitude for the community for their help in earlier instances, on one occasion saying he was proud of the fact that the community did help out with this. Historically, the police and the LGBTQ community haven't really mixed. Pride did start out as a protest against the police's treatment of them after all. For years, queer people couldn't report crimes against them to the police because being homosexual was illegal. They would literally get arrested if they outed themselves. Although in many places in the Western world homosexuality has been decriminalised for many years, the same thoughts and worries still prevail. Many times gay people will still be treated differently or just dismissed by the police. Just look at the treatment of transgender people currently. I also refer back to the Stephen Port case again that I mentioned in the opening of this episode. That was around the same time frame as this. This also kind of links to the criticism of the media's use of photos in the aftermath of the murders, because there was a very clear imbalance in the images they used, with one Canadian newspaper widely publishing a photo of MacArthur smiling at Niagara Falls, a rainbow ironically in the background, alongside a mugshot of Dean Lissowick. Why is Lissowick being portrayed as the criminal in this instance? The media just claimed they pulled photos from wherever they could find for reporting requirement. They had deadlines to meet, so they just went onto MacArthur's Facebook page, and Dean had no digital footprint, so they couldn't really find any photos of him. But does this not raise a question about ethics? Why are deadlines more important than respecting victims? All in all, the entire handling of this case was just beyond poor by both the media and the authorities. Every year, the TPS receive over 4,000 missing persons reports. 51 Division, which includes Church and Wellesley, had 600 missing person reports between 2014 and 2018. According to Louisa Dion, who runs the website Ontario's Missing Adults, missing men are taken less seriously than missing women because we tend to think men can take care of themselves. When men go missing, you assume it's off their own back and not because of foul play, because nobody's going to hurt men. The patriarchy, guys, it hurts us all, men and women alike. At the time all of this came to a head, the city had been working to reduce the TPS budget. There was a staffing crisis with working conditions said to be at breaking point. They'd reduced by 500 officers since 2010, and there'd also been a huge spate of early retirements. Toronto Police Association president noted, when we have a stressed out officer, when we have people who are burned out, it really does impact public interaction. When Laura Wells disappeared, her family claimed that the police told them that her case was not high priority because she'd been homeless for several years. Why did this make her less important to find? And when she was found in a Rosedale River, she remained unidentified for a long time. Both the police and the 519 Community Centre were informed of her discovery, but they failed to follow up with transgender-focused organisations. Her family tried to report her as missing, but they were brushed off. She was found, she was unidentified, she was clearly transgender, but they failed to check in with the queer communities and queer organisations. How was this oversight allowed to happen? In March 2019, the community stated they were no longer surprised by the police incompetence in the MacArthur investigation. TPS had actually been banned from attending Pride Toronto in 2017, and there had been talks or closed-door talks about returning. Progress was made, but then following MacArthur's arrest, Pride's executive director and 5 LGBT organisations released a statement asking the TPS to withdraw its application to march in uniform. The discussion around police being at Pride is a very intricate one. There's not really any easy answer, but the hard truth is that a lot of queer people just don't feel comfortable with uniformed officers in attendance when they don't feel protected by them. Instead, they feel actively targeted. In January 2018, the Alliance for South Asian AIDS Prevention demanded that the TPS commission an external review of the entire investigation, and Chief Saunders himself concluded that the public wouldn't be able to get clear and credible answers without an independent external review. Chief Saunders himself concluded that the public wouldn't be able to get clear and credible answers without an independent external review, and it was at this point that he suggested it should also consider systemic bias in the force. Remember, early 2018 is when MacArthur's crimes were coming to light, so these calls are coming in literally as it's being reported. In mid-March 2018, a group of LGBTQ advocates also demanded an immediate inquiry, and in mid-April, the board unanimously approved a group to define the specifics of this review. The working group reported on June 15, 2018, that the missing persons investigations of MacArthur's alleged victims could be examined up to the point at which the investigations involved MacArthur. They estimated the inquiry would take 15 months and cost $2.5 million Canadian dollars, which was later increased to $3 million. The advisory panel included people from all walks of life to basically make the decision, and the independent review ended up finding that systemic discrimination did contribute to failings in a number of investigations. Gloria Epstein found there were serious flaws and notes that the police could have done better. She also said, to be clear, we are past the time for conversation only. The public is entitled to insist on transformative change with measurable, sustainable outcomes, timeline for completion, and accountability. Intent to discriminate is not the issue here. Proper missing persons investigations should not depend on whose voices are the loudest or most empowered in sounding the alarm. The issues identified included a lack of communication within the police service, so between the force and the police board, as well as with the community, as well as an often unnecessary amount of secrecy that undermined public trust. Epstein also found that investigations were inconsistent and in many instances, basic investigative steps were overlooked or delayed, while searches were at times disorganised, incomplete or poorly documented. She found that some police officers had misconceptions or stereotypical ideas of the LGBT community. The community hadn't been making it up, they were being treated differently. She wrote, "My extensive engagement with community members and organisations confirmed that many people deeply mistrust the Toronto Police. This long-standing mistrust may not be directly related to missing persons cases, but is often rooted in systemic or overt bias or discrimination. I mean, if you look back at the things that were missed, the 2016 strangling incident was overlooked completely. The police only became aware of this incident in 2018 after the man came forward after MacArthur's arrest. There weren't even records of it. On February 1st, 2019, Sergeant Paul Gauthier, who dealt with the 2016 incident, was charged with insubordination and neglect of duty regarding policy on reporting domestic violence in front of a police tribunal. This was a formerly highly praised officer, and he missed this. Now, Gauthier claimed that he was being made a scapegoat for the police, that he was being used to divert the media attention from Saunders' aforementioned inflammatory remarks. He felt that he was being personally blamed for the murders of Andrew Kinsman and Saleem Essen, and he was actually diagnosed with PTSD on the back of this. I do think that the complaint in 2016 should have been taken more seriously. The link should have been made, but I think this is more of an institutional failure here rather than an individual one. And in 2021, Gauthier was found not guilty on all charges. But this wasn't the only thing that was missed. In late 2017, another man claimed to have met MacArthur on a dating app for a liaison involving bondage and submission role-playing. From the get-go, it was very strange. MacArthur refused to go to the man's apartment because of security cameras in the area, and during this particular encounter, he made the man a GHB cocktail upon request to relax and heighten the sexual encounter. The man soon suspected, however, that he'd been overdosed and claimed that MacArthur ignored his limits and his safe words before attempting to block his airways in numerous ways. The man claimed he lost consciousness and was only saved by the return of MacArthur's roommate. The information available about this incident isn't great, but I assume it was reported, and once again it was just brushed off, because the man said the police contacted him the day after MacArthur's arrest, and unless it was reported, they wouldn't have known to contact him. There is no denying some huge mistakes were made. The police service did accept the findings of the review, and they said they were committed to implementing its recommendations, despite saying it's difficult for them to see the failings. They said the shortcomings are inexcusable, and they asked the community of the gay village to give them an opportunity to make things right. In the end, the report included 151 recommendations, including triaging cases that appropriate agencies, including social agencies, are involved, meaning that in some cases, police might not need to be involved at all. All of this is fairly recent in the grand scheme of things, so we can't tell just yet how much of a difference has been made, but I hope this case and the victims are something that remains in the back of the minds of the Toronto Police Service for a really long time. Do I believe that MacArthur could have been apprehended long before he was? Do I believe lives could have been saved if the community had been listened to? Absolutely. I have no idea how to end an episode like this. There's no way to round this up with a neat little bow. 8 men lost their lives at the hand of this man, who has never really provided any motivation for his crimes. There was no reason for these people to die other than some sort of sexual gratification. But hopefully this case does mean that nothing like this will happen in Toronto, in Canada, ever again. I hope the lessons have been learned. Just look out for your community. If you see things are happening, report it, scream it from the rooftops. You can't guarantee that you'll be listened to, but do something. Thank you so much for tuning in today. If you like what I'm doing here on my channel, then please do check out my channel memberships down below. It's just £2.99 a month to help support me and what I'm doing. This video, for example, has taken me all day to film. I started at 9:30 this morning. It is now 3:30 in the afternoon, as you might be able to tell from the light changes. The lighting in this video has been terrible, but that's what happens when a video is this long. It's taken me weeks to research, weeks to write. So again, if you can show any support, even if that's just by liking or subscribing or leaving a comment, that is much appreciated. Again, thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.